Moscow. December 1991. The winter air cuts like a blade. Inside a cramped apartment in the city's outer districts, an elderly woman stands in a line that stretches down 4 flights of stairs. She's been waiting 3 hours. The store below has received a shipment of bread. Yesterday there was none. Tomorrow there might be none again. Outside, the red flag with the hammer and sickle still flies above the Kremlin, but everyone knows it won't be there much longer. The Soviet Union, a superpower that once challenged America for control of the world, is dying. Not from war, not from invasion, but from something far more invisible and far more devastating: economic collapse. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. This collapse wasn't an accident. It wasn't simply because communism didn't work. The truth is far more calculated, far more deliberate, and far more revealing about how power actually operates in our world. What if I told you that the Soviet Union was brought down not by military defeat, but by a carefully orchestrated economic war? What if the decisions made in Washington, Riyadh, and Basel had more to do with the fall of the USSR than anything happening in Moscow? Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand how economic systems can be weaponized, how empires fall not with a bang, but with a bankruptcy, and how the world you live in today was shaped by events most people have never even heard of. And if you want to understand how global power really works, hit that subscribe button now. Because the stories we uncover here don't make it into the mainstream narrative, but they should. Let's go back to 1973. The Soviet Union looks unstoppable. It has nuclear weapons. It has a massive military. It controls half of Europe and supports revolutionary movements from Cuba to Angola. On paper, it's a superpower. But there's a crack in the foundation that almost nobody sees. And that crack is oil. The Soviet economy runs on a simple model: sell oil and gas to the West, use that money to buy grain from abroad, and keep the population fed. It's not complicated, but it works. Throughout the 1970s, oil prices are high. Money flows into Moscow. The Soviet leadership believes they've found a way to sustain their empire without reform. But here's the question nobody was asking. What happens when the oil money stops? In 1979, something changes. The Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. It's a disaster from the start, but that's not the part that matters for this story. What matters is how the world responds. The United States, under President Carter and then Reagan, begins a strategy that has nothing to do with tanks or missiles. It's about money, about markets, about leverage, and the Soviets don't see it coming. Here's where the story gets interesting, because while Soviet troops are fighting in the mountains of Afghanistan, a different kind of war is being waged thousands of miles away, in the trading floors of New York, the palaces of Saudi Arabia, and the policy rooms of Washington. Let me explain how this works. The Soviet Union needs hard currency, dollars mainly, to buy goods it can't produce itself: wheat, technology, machinery. To get those dollars, it sells oil and natural gas. In the 1970s, when oil prices are high, the system works beautifully. The USSR is raking in billions. But then, in the early 1980s, something shifts. Oil prices start to fall, not slowly, dramatically. By 1986, the price of oil has collapsed by more than half. Why? Was it just market forces? Bad luck? No, it was strategy. In 1985, Saudi Arabia, under pressure and coordination with the United States, makes a decision to flood the global market with oil. They open the taps, supply skyrockets, prices crash, and the Soviet Union, which depends on oil revenues to survive, suddenly finds itself in a financial freefall. Think about this like a family that's been living on credit cards, making minimum payments, getting by, until suddenly their income is cut in half. Everything unravels, fast. The Soviet leadership is now facing a nightmare. Oil revenues collapse, but the bills don't stop. The military still needs funding. The people still need food. The satellite states in Eastern Europe still need subsidies to keep them loyal. So what do? They borrow. This is where the trap closes. Throughout the 1980s, the Soviet Union begins borrowing heavily from Western banks. They need dollars to cover the gap left by falling oil prices. At first, it seems manageable. After all, the USSR is a superpower. Surely it can pay back these loans, but debt works like gravity. Once you're in it, it pulls you down faster than you realize. Here's the mechanism. The Soviets borrow in dollars, but they earn in rubles and oil revenues that are now collapsing. To pay back the loans, they need to sell more oil. But oil prices keep falling, so they borrow more, and the debt grows, and the interest compounds. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union is spending a huge portion of its budget just servicing debt. Money that should be going to factories, infrastructure, and food is instead going to banks in London and New York. And here's the part that most people miss. This wasn't accidental. The West understood exactly what was happening. They understood that the Soviet economy was fragile, that it depended on oil, that falling prices would create a crisis. And they used that knowledge as a weapon. There's a term for this in economics: Financial warfare, you don't need to fire a shot. You just need to control the variables that matter. Commodity prices, access to credit, currency flows, and the target collapses under its own weight. But there's another layer to this. Because at the same time, the United States was doing something else, something that would drain Soviet resources even faster. In 1983, President Reagan announces the Strategic Defense Initiative, known as Star Wars. The idea is to build a missile defense system in space that could shoot down Soviet nuclear missiles. Now, whether this system could actually work is debatable. Many scientists at the time said it couldn't, but that didn't matter. What mattered was perception. The Soviet leadership believed it could work, or at least they couldn't afford to assume it wouldn't. So they responded the only way they knew how, by pouring billions into their own military programs to counter it. But here's the problem. The Soviet economy is already bleeding from low oil prices and rising debt. Now, they're trying to match American military spending, even though the American economy is 3 times larger and far more productive. It's like a man running a race while carrying a boulder on his back. Every step gets harder. Every mile takes more energy. Eventually, he collapses. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union is spending nearly a quarter of its entire GDP on the military. Compare that to the United States, which was spending around 6%. The math doesn't work. It never could. And so the Soviet leadership faces a choice. Collapse now or reform and hope you can survive. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev becomes General Secretary in 1985. He's younger than the old guard. He understands that the system is broken. He knows that something has to change. So he introduces 2 policies. Glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. The idea is simple. Make the system more transparent. Allow some market reforms. Reduce military spending. And maybe, just maybe, the Soviet Union can survive. But here's what he doesn't understand. You can't reform a system that's built on centralized control without it falling apart. Think of it like this. Imagine a dam holding back a river. For decades, the dam has been solid, unmoving, but now it's cracking. Gorbachev's solution is to open a small valve at the bottom to relieve pressure. But once you open that valve, the water doesn't flow slowly, it bursts through, and the whole dam collapses. Glasnost allows people to speak freely for the first time in decades. And what do they say? They say the system is broken. They say the leadership has lied. They say they want freedom. Perestroika tries to introduce market mechanisms, but the Soviet economy doesn't have the infrastructure for markets. There are no price signals, no supply chains, no private property. So instead of gradual reform, you get chaos. Factories shut down, goods disappear. By 1989, the Soviet Union is in full economic crisis. Store shelves are empty, people are angry, and the satellite states, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, are breaking away. Gorbachev tries to hold it together, but the forces he's unleashed are too strong. The system that took 70 years to build is now collapsing in real time. In August 1991, hardliners in the Soviet government try to stage a coup. They want to reverse Gorbachev's reforms and restore control. For 3 days, tanks surround the Russian parliament. The world holds its breath. Not because of military force, but because people refuse to obey. Soldiers refuse to fire on civilians. The old guard realizes they've lost legitimacy. They've lost authority. And without that, they have nothing. By December 1991, it's over. The Soviet Union officially dissolves. 15 republics become independent nations. The red flag comes down. But here's the truth that doesn't get talked about enough. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of tanks or bullets. It collapsed because of debt, oil prices, military spending, and economic warfare. It collapsed because the West understood that in the modern world, money is power. And if you control the flow of money, you control everything. So what happened after? Russia descended into chaos throughout the 1990s. Hyperinflation wiped out savings. Oligarchs bought up state assets for pennies on the dollar. Life expectancy dropped. It was, by many measures, an economic catastrophe worse than the Great Depression. But for the United States, it was victory. The Cold War was over. There was no rival superpower. America was now the sole hegemon, able to shape the global order on its terms. And the lesson learned by every government watching was clear. Economic power is the ultimate weapon. You don't need to invade. You don't need bombs. You just need to control the systems that matter. Currency, debt, energy, trade. That lesson still echoes today. When you see sanctions, trade wars, currency manipulation, you're seeing the same playbook. The tools change. The principles don't. The Soviet Union fell not because its people stopped believing in it, though many did. It fell because the system ran out of money. And when an empire runs out of money, everything else falls apart. So the next time someone tells you the Soviet Union collapsed because communism doesn't work, you can tell them the real story. It collapsed because it was bankrupted, strategically, deliberately, and very, very effectively. Because in the end, history isn't written by armies. It's written by those who control the flow of capital, and whoever controls that controls the future.